Tim Soutphommasane is the author of Reclaiming Patriotism, Nationbuilding for Australian Progressives. Tim is a political philosopher. He is also a journalist. He has just commenced work as a research fellow with the National Centre for Australian Studies at Monash University, and also working with Per Capita on policy issues. So political philosophy into policy and journalism. So Tim is a very busy boy. You might know his column, Ask a Philosopher, in The Australian. Tim also writes for The Monthly, for The Guardian, has opinion pieces in The Australian and the Sydney Morning Herald, and had the lead essay in the Future, I think it was called Next Left or What's Left, the series that The Australian ran last year. So without further ado, I introduce Tim.
Thank you. And thank you to Tony. Tony introduced me as a political philosopher and journalist. I like to think of myself more as a dilettante. Can I say it's a real privilege to share a platform with Peter Bailhartz, a man whose scholarship and work I've admired and certainly read as an undergraduate at Sydney University. And I'm glad to say that we have some common ground in having a disdain for weak coffee. And I say this from the perspective of someone who has just spent 5 years in England drinking what was usually very weak filter coffee. I do agree with you, Peter, no Kinder Cafe for me either, an espresso please. We're also in agreement, Peter and I, in believing that social democracy has to be about more than just fear and conservation. It has to be about ambition and hope. So that's the second point of agreement. But as should be clear, there are a number of points on which Peter and I disagree. And Peter has very kindly anticipated some of my remarks tonight by noting that I believe that social democracy has to include liberalism, that liberalism is a part of social democracy. And I don't take a backward step from that, but what Peter didn't say was that I argued that social democracy is indeed more than just liberalism. Now, I went to school in Sydney at an agricultural high school, studying or working on the farm on some days, working with livestock on occasions. And I say this because I think that social democracy really represents the hybrid vigour of liberalism and socialism. It is a synthesis. It's about combining the best elements of those two traditions. And in that sense, it is indeed a practice more than it is a political doctrine. The other, I suppose, main point of disagreement that I would have with what Peter's just said is on patriotism and civic virtue. But of course I would say that having devoted the last few years to studying patriotism and to making the case for a left liberal, social democratic model of patriotism, because I think social democracy is about common purposes, it's about common ground, it's about solidarity. But these values, these aspirations are only possible if we have a shared identity. Part of the inspiration for tonight's forum was Tony Jutt's lecture at New York University, which was published in the New York Review of Books last December. Now, I'm a big fan of Tony Jutt. I'm a big fan of the New York Review as well. And Jutt's essay, as those of you who have read it will know, was typically insightful, but it wasn't altogether inspiring. For those of us who are sympathetic to social democracy, and this being a gathering sponsored by the Fabians, I will assume that most of us are, to some extent, sympathetic. Judd's piece really appeared as something of an obituary for the democratic left. Now, Tony Moore, our moderator, has already outlined some of what Tony Judd has argued, but what Tony didn't mention was Judd's conviction, belief, that social democracy's future lies in what he called a social democracy of fear. A social democracy of fear. So rather than seek optimistic progress, Judd argues, social democrats have to fight to conserve the past achievements of the left. And by past achievements, he means the welfare state, he means public goods, he means a striving for greater equality, he means a civic bond based on common purposes. But as I said, the guiding instinct for Judd is fear. Fear, that is, of the terrifying consequences of not defending the left's legacy. Fear of what the right, what conservatives might do if they had the chance to destroy past gains. Well, naturally, I'd like to offer a slightly different perspective to Judd, and obviously something of a different perspective to Peter's as well. Social democracy must offer a steadfast language of hope and ambition. This isn't to say, of course, that the centre-left has to become intoxicated with idealistic illusions, but it's important to have a positive agenda and to know what you're standing for as much as what you're standing against. Of course, the debate really is about what the left does stand for today. I'd like to make a modest case tonight in favour of a social democracy that has a renewed commitment to social justice and citizenship. And it's a social democracy that goes beyond a traditional centre-left understanding of the welfare state, because I think sentimentalism can only get us so far. And it's an understanding of social democracy that unapologetically embraces a liberal as well as a socialist heritage. Like I said, hybrid vigour. First, what do we mean by the term social democracy? Peter has already done us a great service in outlining some of its historical features. I'd like to add, though, that I'm of the view that social democracy has always had a fundamental, a deep indeterminacy. It does mean different things to different people. So for some, it means democratic socialism. It's something with Marxist, socialist roots. For others, social democracy is more left liberal. And this is perhaps the view that I would espouse, that it's a hybrid of socialist, liberal, and indeed labourist ideas. Social democracy in this sense has always, as Tony Judd has written in a previous work, a practice in lifelong search of its theory. And I think he's right, and I'll tell you why. Try and name me the authoritative thinker or political philosophy of social democracy. We'd struggle to find one. Whereas classical liberalism has a figure of the stature of John Locke, whereas modern libertarianism has someone of the standing of von Hayek, whereas full-blooded socialism has, of course, Karl Marx, and whereas conservatism has Edmund Burke, I don't think there is a social democratic thinker of equivalent standing. Yes, there are the Webbs. Yes, there are the Shaws, the Coles, the Tawneys, the Bernsteins, the Croslins. Some would say John Rawls as well. But there is, in my view, no authoritative political philosopher of the centre-left. Now, why is that? Why is there no authoritative political philosopher of the left? In part, I believe it's because social democracy is indeed a practice rather than it is a doctrine. It's something of a political creed, a pragmatic ideology, but always evolving. But this quality means that it's always had the character of being a melange rather than being something that can be pinned down. To give you an example, if we think of some of the figures associated with social democracy, and I'm thinking here of post-war model of social democracy, we think of people like John Maynard Keynes, we think of people like William Beveridge, two of the key architects of the British welfare state. But of course, they weren't socialists, they were liberals, in the tradition of Asquith and Gladstone and others. So it's in this sense that social democracy is something that has both liberal and socialist qualities. Having said that, I do think there is a definable core of social democracy, and that's a commitment to social justice. There's a commitment to ensuring that there's a fair distribution of opportunity, of resources, of recognition in society. I mean, people always say that social justice is somewhat vague, that it's an idealistic slogan. But I take it quite seriously. I think that any genuine social democrat would too. And the kinds of values that are brought into play with social justice are things like equality, community, trust. And I would say that there's implicated as well in social democracy a certain political economy, a belief that the market can't be left alone, but has to be civilized by the benevolent hand of the state. Now, if this is what social democracy must involve, then Australia has always had a social democratic tradition, in the sense that it's always been pragmatic, progressive, and unconstrained by doctrine. Unconstrained by doctrine. You think here of the Australian equivalent of Tocqueville, Albert Métain, who said of Australia that it was a country that was guided by un socialisme sans doctrine, a socialism without doctrine. You think as well of how Australians take values of the fair go and egalitarianism very seriously. I think these provide a genuine ethos for how we conduct our lives together. You think too of how capitalism has been civilised through the architecture of the Australian settlement. And yet it's said from time to time, and indeed even still today, that Australia has never really been truly social democratic, because social democracy is something to be found in Europe. Its highest expression was always Scandinavian utopia. Social democratic solidarity, if it was ever going to be found, was going to be found in the company of tanned blondes chopping down pine trees to make IKEA furniture. And others would say too that the welfare states of Australia and Britain have always been labourist achievements rather than social democratic. And moreover, in the Australian case, the welfare state was an achievement of a liberal in large part. I'm talking here of Alfred Deakin. And then, and there's more, and then even if there has been a social democratic achievement in Australia, even if there has been, much of it has now been actively dismantled by successive governments, indeed including Labor governments, privatisation, corporatisation, deregulation. So even if the ALP could be considered a proxy of social democracy, albeit imperfect, it has betrayed all social democratic aspirations by becoming, in effect, a hollowed-out liberal party of the bourgeois, emptied out of its historic traditions. And I hear some yeses. Unfortunately, I disagree with that assessment. I think that kind of judgment, that kind of bleak judgment, gets one thing fundamentally wrong. And that is to judge social democracy against a standard of political doctrine rather than as political practice. Now, social democracy, as I've said, is something that's always evolving. And of course, the world around us changes too. Let me give you an example. Once upon a time, social democrats could believe in the kind of comprehensive welfare state that Jutt celebrates, that all-encompassing social service state. But in our globalised world, it has to stand, and by it I mean social democracy has to stand for a more sophisticated understanding of the state. One in which the state doesn't so much replace markets, but regulates, designs, facilitates markets. And this was something, in my opinion, that was grasped with wonderful clarity by Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, great Labor modernisers. And these are achievements that the centre-left have to be proud of, because they transformed Australia, they opened up opportunity. I think sentimentalism is also very dangerous when it comes to the understanding of welfare. Social democrats like to think of the welfare state as its fundamental achievement, and that's true. But again, the times around us change. And universal access to welfare entitlements is just no longer tenable as a practice. Indeed, it was only feasible in the context of full employment. And I point to Amartya Sen's recent book on social justice, The Idea of Justice, which is a philosophical treatment of the topic. And Sen there argues that the centre-left can indeed no longer define social justice in terms of passive access to primary goods, but must understand it in terms of expanding individuals' capabilities. The idea here is welfare as a means rather than an end in itself. So where to then for social democracy in today's Australia? Well, there's certainly been revived interest in social democracy from our Prime Minister. He's a very busy man, of course, but when he's not busy writing children's books, he can be found writing tributes to the great social democratic gods of Keynes and Stiglitz. Our Prime Minister has certainly declared himself a sworn enemy of neoliberalism. But more important, Rudd Labor has been a nation-building government. It's had nation-building ambitions. This is a government that likes to build things. Now, I would say that such ambitions, nation-building ambitions, are a necessary component of social democracy in one sense. And they're necessary because the social democratic state must stand for collective interests, collective purposes, collective goods. And yes, the private sector can't be relied upon to provide these things. The state has to step in here. But it's important that we have a more sophisticated understanding of what the role of the state actually is. On occasions, the state must build the infrastructure, but on other occasions, it's not appropriate for the state to build infrastructure. Its role should be to facilitate. Now, there are some who would say in response to all this that we shouldn't swallow the rhetoric of nation building uncritically, and they're right. Recent events have shown us that nation building, especially when it's pursued in haste, can lead to problems, tragic problems. And our history is littered with examples of white elephants, failed nation building projects. Now, there are some who would say as well that Rudd Labor's understanding of nation building doesn't conform with the kind of nation building I've been talking about, that Rudd Labour has been rather crude in its embrace of nation building. There are cynics, I'm sure there are some in this room, who would say that nation building for Kevin Rudd and his ministers is really just about hard hats and about new school building projects. But if you take a broader view of nation building, I think you can appreciate that there are various dimensions of nation building. Yes, there's the hard dimension of nation building, and I mean here by hard physical infrastructure, but there's a soft dimension as well, and by this I mean the cultural aspects of a national political community, cultural aspects. And I would say that it's this soft dimension of nation building, the cultural side of nation building, is where social democratic renewal, I don't think it's about invention, I think it's about renewal, might need to take place. I should say one thing. I think there's no doubt that social democrats need a new narrative, that social democrats need a new story through which to build political coalitions. That's very important. And what that story must be, I think, has yet to be written. And it's going to be a challenge, because much of what social democracy sought to realise has, well, already been realised. Poverty, social deprivation, while they still exist, are no longer the blight that they once were. We don't have children working in factories, at least not in this country. So if inequality and exclusion remain problems, then I would say that they are probably more cultural than economic, or just as cultural and economic today. Because ours is quickly becoming a society of insiders and outsiders, a world in which there are those who find in change, and there's a lot of change, more of a threat than an opportunity. And this is the real challenge that faces social democrats today. Because where there's cultural anxiety, where there's nothing but fear, the kind of solidarity and community that social democrats predicate their understanding of the political world on cannot exist. Where there is nothing but fear, we become less willing to share things with strangers. We're more likely to retreat into sometimes nasty identities. And I think you all know what I mean here. So this is why I have pretty deep reservations about the kind of social democracy of fear that Tony Judt endorses. Nostalgia, even when born of noble minds such as Jutt's, can be a very dangerous weapon in today's world. Let me conclude by saying just what I mean by a need to combat this tide of anxiety and fear. Social democrats have to reaffirm the value of community. We have to build a new story of citizenship. And the best hope for this is not in cosmopolitanism, is not in humanitarianism, it's in a national project. A sense of belonging to a national community, a commitment to a common good forged by history and shared experience. The kinds of things that I would associate with civic virtue and patriotism. Now, for a long time, the left have been very fearful of patriotism. Any endorsement of a love of country is seen as chauvinism, seen as racism, seen as appealing to the baser side of our nature. Yes, sometimes that's true, but let's get one thing straight. You can't embark on a progressive project, you can't go about building a community of sharing, of solidarity, unless there is a sense of common purpose, unless there is a sense of collective self-improvement. So I'll leave you with that thought. Patriotism, civic virtue, community. Those are the things that I think must lie at the heart of a social democracy of hope rather than of fear. Now, some will say that I'm too optimistic, but you know what? Optimism is the hallmark of the progressive. The progressive impulse must always be to fight injustice, must always be to expand opportunity, must always be to pursue the common good. But most importantly, we must always believe that through human effort we can achieve progress.
Thank you very much.